Stance phase.
The stance phase represents about 60% of the gait cycle. Stance phase has 5 parts: heel contact, foot flat, mid stance, heel off, and toe off. Heel contact. Heel contact marks the beginning of the gait cycle. At initial contact, the knee is extended and the ankle is held in neutral dorsiflexion through isometric activation of the dorsiflexor muscles, the tibialis anterior. Knee extensors, the quadriceps, are eccentrically active and slightly flexed to 5 degrees to prevent the knee from buckling as weight is transferred onto the stance limb. The hip extensors are working isometrically to prevent the trunk from jackknifing forward and bring the hip into 30 degrees of extension.
Foot flat. Foot flat begins at 8% of the gait cycle.
The entire plantar surface of the foot is in contact with the ground, also known as a loading response phase. Immediately following foot flat, the opposite limb begins to leave the ground and enters into early swing phase. The ankle is in 5 to 10 degrees of plantar flexion. This motion is controlled through eccentric activation of the dorsiflexor muscles. Knee continues to flex to 15 degrees. Knee extensors continue to be active eccentrically. Hip extensors shift from isometric to slight concentric activation, moving hip into 20 degrees of flexion.
Mid stance. Mid stance begins at 30% of the gait cycle.
Mid stance occurs when lower limb approaches the vertical position. Leg is in single limb support as the other leg is freely swinging forward. Ankle approaches 5 degrees of dorsiflexion, with the dorsiflexor muscle becoming inactive. Instead, the plantar muscles are working eccentrically. The hip and knee are near extension. Because the line of gravity falls just anterior to the medial lateral axis of rotation of the knee is mechanically locked into extension. Little activation of the quadriceps is required at this time. Hip approaches 0 degrees of extension. The hip extensors, such as the gluteus maximus, are slightly active concentrically to help stabilize the hip as the body is propelled forward. Hip abductors, the gluteus medius, of the stance leg are active to stabilize the hip in the frontal plane, preventing the opposite side of the pelvis from dropping excessively. Heel off.
Heel off begins at 40% of the gait cycle.
Heel off occurs just after mid-stance as the lower leg and ankle begin to push off to propel the body upward and forward. This phase begins as the heel breaks contact with the ground. The ankle continues to dorsiflex to about 10 degrees. This stretches the Achilles tendon, which prepares the calf muscles for propulsion. As heel off progresses, the plantar flexor muscles switch from eccentric to concentric activation. Extended knee begins to flex to 10 degrees, often driven by a short burst of activity from the hamstring muscles. Eccentric activation of the hip flexors, in particular the iliopsoas, helps control the rate and amount of the hip flexion. Tight ligaments of the hip or tight hip flexor muscles will reduce the amount of hip extension at this point, thereby reducing stride length. Toe off.
Toe off begins at 60% of the gait cycle.
This is the final event of the stance phase. At toe off, toes are in marked hyperextension at the metatarsal phalangeal joints. The ankle continues to plantar flex to about 15 degrees through concentric activation of the plantar flexor muscles. Knee is flexed to 30 degrees and the hip is in neutral position. At the very end of this phase, the slightly extended hip starts to flex due to concentric activation of the hip flexor muscles.